Let me know when you're in.
Ready.
Welcome to Open House New York 2020 Newtown Creek Tour. This tour is sponsored by the Greater Astoria Historical Society and the Newtown Creek Alliance. My name is Bob Singleton, Executive Director of GAHS and your narrator for this tour. And the photos of Newtown Creek, the beautiful photos of Newtown Creek, is by Mitch Waxman, who's a board member of the Newtown Creek Alliance. So let's get started. This is the map of Newtown Creek as it originally existed back in colonial times. It does not have this extent today, but there are still a few names that we may be familiar with if you live Newtown Creek or around Newtown Creek, if you had a tour around it. Edible Basin in Long Island City, Hunters Point, which is the very, very tip of Long Island City between the East River and Newtown Creek. Dutch Kills, which is a estuary that is further towards the east. Well Basin, which is across the from Dutch Kills. Penny Bridge, which is the midpoint. Furman's Island, which is now no longer an island. English Kills and Maspeth, which are at the end of the creek. Bushwick, which is in Brooklyn, and Bushwick Inlet. We don't have any images of the area before it was developed. There were very, very few images. This one was taken, a painting that was done about 1890 or so. This is Queens Plaza, a very, very busy place today, very noisy and busy with the train and the entrance to the bridge. There is a marsh in front of us. Behind us would be Sunnyside. To the left of us would be Brooklyn. To the right of us would be Ravenswood, Astoria. We are facing east. In the distance, we can see New York City across the East River, and that spire is St. Patrick's Cathedral. The first settlement of Newtown Creek by European colonists was in a site of a native camp near Maspeth. These were English who came in from New England. They were religious dissenters. They were looking for basically creating a utopian society in the wilderness. So Stuyvesant put them at the end of Newtown Creek out of sight. They created a lot of trouble. There was a lot of issues that we won't get into with this group. So Stuyvesant felt that perhaps another group needed to be nearby to kind of keep things in order. So he got a Dutch community that wanted a settlement, and he created Bushwick. Now the English Kills are the blue area. Bushwick is the red area. This is a map. There's Newtown Creek. It's upside down. This is the East River. There's Newtown Creek. And there was a lot of disorder, a lot of disagreement as to where the border was between the two communities. So he settled upon a glacier boulder that would just have been left there for since the last glacier melted some 10, 15,000 years in the past. This is the boulder. It's still there. It's called Arbitration Rock, and the star location will be right about here. There were other adjustments to the border, some as late as the 20th century, where they tried to square the border with the street grid pattern. But the original Arbitration Rock is still there. I'm not going to reveal its location because I don't want it to be vandalized or anything like that. But it's really interesting when you have something medieval as a boundary between two districts, and you can turn around and see the 21st century skyline of New York City. It's quite quite an interesting contrast there. Now, as I said before, we don't have paintings or sketches of the area, but there was an artist who lived in Long Island, not too far away, was familiar with the community, commuted frequently to Manhattan, so he was familiar with what this area looked like, and he drew paintings of what life was like in the early 19th century. And I think those paintings apply to the community around uh, uh, the Newtown Creek. The first tide mill on Newtown Creek was by a person named Borger Jorison. He created a tide mill at some point in the middle of the 17th century, about 1650 or 1645 or so. His house, actually, we have a photograph of it. It remained until about 1910 or so. It was right off of Queens Plaza, at the beginning of Northern Boulevard, really abutting the train yard. And kids would start to break into it. So he thought best to dismantle the house and put an office building there. But we, as I said, we do have the house. This is what his tide mill would have looked like. This would be, again, in Queens Plaza, right about where Northern Boulevard started. Um, and as you can see, here's the wheel. The way the tide mill worked was the water, the tides would come in, the water would fill a basin, and then when the tides would go out, they'd reverse the wheel. The basin would drain over the wheel, and would grind corn or grind wheat. This really was the game changer for New York, were these tide mills, because at that point, New York was able to put together a product that people wanted, which is flour and corn mills, particularly in England. They were able to build ships to transport this. And this really started New York City into its path of greatness. And it's commemorated to this day in the New York City coat of arms, where there are two flour barrels on the coat of arms to commemorate the importance of the milling industry. The tide mill itself was destroyed about 1860 when the Long Island Railroad came through in what is today the Sunnyside Yard along Northern Boulevard. But the millstones were saved. They were preserved by the family that had lived in the house, had inherited the house. And when our house was torn down, they donated the stones to a sidewalk in front of the clock tower building, which was a bank at the time, where they remained up until about 10 years ago when they redesigned Queens Plaza. They took the stones out and repositioned them. One of the stones got injured in the process. You can see there's a chip there on the side. Fortunately, they kept the stone and glued it back together again. The stones aren't as old as the tide mill. They probably date from about 1800. Really neat thing though is you can go to Queens Plaza and check out these stones. Um, and you know, they're from the 1600s. You look over, you see the railroads from the 1800s, you see the tall buildings, 21st century. You see 350 years of history in one location. And you're really hard pressed to see something like that pretty much anywhere, in New York City or anywhere else. So Queens Plaza is a pretty special place on a number of reasons. Now we go back to the artwork of William Sidney Mount, which gives us some imaginary views of what the area looked like. On your left, as you can see, is a stream that is emptying into a larger body of water. This would be a sort of what the mouth of Newtown Creek would have looked like as it emptied into the East River. And on the right, you see sort of a pond, a wide area. This would be where English Kills would be at the very beginning of the stream. And so, yes, they're not the exact pictures, but they are pictures of the vicinity. And it gives us a pretty good feeling of what the area looked like in the earliest years. On the left, we see people harvesting salt grass, which was really important for the cattle and the horses, livestock. In winter, when they were locked into their stables and didn't have grass to forage, they fed them salt grass, which was from the salt meadows, which was very rich in nutrients, and kept the animals healthy throughout the winter. On the right is a nice quiet scene of a young lad helping a woman who worked for his family. She was doing eel spearing. It looks very similar to what Newtown Creek would have looked like, and that background, that little gentle rise, that hill, is very similar as to where Calvary Cemetery would be. And at the early part of the 19th century, before the cemetery moved in, it was a pasture that looked very, very similar to that. Incidentally, the woman is obviously African American. The community was very, very multicultural from the very beginning. When the English and Dutch were living next to each other, New York City was always a multi-ethnic city. There was slavery in New York. Slavery ended very early. And by the time the census of 1820, a generation before the Civil War, there were no slaves. Basically, it was a situation where somebody would be living at a house doing work, and should once a year they had an opportunity to go around within the community and offer their services to other people to see if they could get a better deal, better. I'll give you an example. Say somebody was a carpenter, and somebody within the community, within the village, wanted to put in a barn. So would go to that person and say, "I'd like to work with you, help you put up your barn." And the person then would go back to the person that employed this man and say, "Well, I'll pay you a fee. Well, let's agree on a fee so that I could use his services to assist me." And that's basically how slavery kind of devolved in the early years of the 19th century. The Black uh, African American people lived within the community throughout history, throughout the 18th century, the 19th century, and there's probably descendants of this community that's still in the borough of Queens to this day. The rivers, the quiet setting, the large expanse of land out in Queens, right next to New York City, made it ripe location for cemeteries. There was a problem of burials in Manhattan. New York was expanding so rapidly. The churches were continuously moving uptown that they had to disinter the cemeteries and then reinter them as the church would move from, say, the Lower East Side to Midtown. Also, many people were buried in places like Madison Square, Bryant Park, Washington Square, which became public parks. These bodies were disinterred. They had to put them someplace. The Catholic Church came out to this area and purchased several hundred acres of what is today Calvary Cemetery. It's the largest cemetery in the world in terms of interments. It's something like 3 million people that are interred just in that one complex alone. They say about the borough of Queens is that there are more people that are buried there than are alive in the borough. On the right, you see a bridge called Penny Bridge that crossed Newtown Creek. It looks like there's a funeral procession that's going across there. So it was near public transportation. It was not too far away from New York City. So it was an ideal location. And in that time, in Victorian times, people on weekends would come out and have picnics at the gravesite of their recently passed, relatives and what have you. And of course, there were places, restaurants and what have you. So when the family would come for a funeral afterwards, they would book a room at one of the restaurants. So it was a very, very lively industry that grew up around Newtown Creek in the very early years. But other industries grew up. Newtown Creek waterway was a perfect place for bulk industries, such as the petroleum industry. The railroads at the time were not fully developed. The roads were atrocious. So if you had heavy bulk items, if you wanted to transport logs, if you wanted to transport oil, you use the waterway. And so they put together these tank farms for the oil industry very early along Newtown Creek. There's the Standard Oil Company works from the 1880s. Rockefeller, one of his first refineries was on Newtown Creek. this was not incorporated like New York City. The laws were a little bit more lax out here. So you could put in a refinery and really didn't have to worry about any kind of regulations. On the right is another dimension of the burgeoning industry, the budding industry of the area. It's called Pottery Beach. Is along Newtown Creek. It had extraordinarily quality, very high quality of clay. Clay is used to make pottery. So the pottery industry in this country, before pottery was imported from Europe, the pottery industry actually started in Brooklyn because they had ready access to the clay on Newtown Creek. Of course, the clay was exhausted, the pottery industry moved to other locations, but this is really the beginning of the pottery industry by using the resources of the creek itself. These are interesting maps that kind of foretell the future of the area. The map on the left was from the 1870s, 1880s. We found in the collection, the Steinway family collection. The Steinways were very interested in making pianos, but they were also interested in transportation. And this was a syndicate that was being put together. You can see a number of red lines there. These were railroads. This is Manhattan in the center. This is New Jersey. This is Queens. This is Brooklyn. And you see here a railroad under the Hudson River going through Midtown Manhattan, coming out under the East River to Newtown Creek, one line going north, another one going into Brooklyn. This was not developed 100% like this. But this foretold a generation later when the Pennsylvania Railroad came through with a tunnel to Penn Station, another tunnel under the East River, and came out in Long Island City and built a viaduct, the Hellgate Bridge. So this is very interesting. People, even before this area really became developed, saw the potential here. And for that reason, on the right, we see one of the first maps of Long Island City. Long Island City is New York's third city after Brooklyn and Queens. Long Island City is basically everything from Steinway, from Rikers Island to Newtown Creek, from the East River to about Woodside, about 51st Street. It's kind of a rectangular shape. Long Island City existed as a separate city from 1870 to 1898. It became part of Greater New York. Transportation, of course, was very important in this period of time. Again, you didn't use the roads. Railroad was the key. And railroad travel was pretty sophisticated for its time. This was a ticket I came across of issued by the Reading Railroad for one continuous passage from Philadelphia to Babylon on Long Island via Long Island City. And you could use this ticket for the return trip also. So what you do is you would take to New York. You would then take the ferry to Long Island City, get on the Long Island Railroad, and go out to Babylon, Long Island. This is the only picture I've seen of the interior of the waiting room for the Long Island Railroad. And you'll notice on the benches are the letters LIRR. This is the terminal. This is the ferry. There's Manhattan. There's the trains getting loaded here in Long Island City. But there were two forms of transportation. Not only was there long distance travel, but it was also local travel for Long Island City. And right next to it was this location. These were horse cars. So you can see you'll see it says Vernon Boulevard, Steinway Avenue. Vernon went up the East River through Ravenswood. Steinway went south along the western border, or it actually was two ways, but this route actually went in a big circle. There were other roads that went to the cemeteries, another one that went along Astoria Boulevard. So in a very, very early period of time, Long Island City had a pretty sophisticated transportation network and grew pretty well because of this. This is another dimension of the burgeoning community. To the left are a knot of men that worked on the railroads. And as you can see, this is a tough group of no-nonsense fellows. Most of the people that moved to Long Island City at this period of time were from Ireland, fresh They just were immigrants that left the Lower East Side and moved into Long Island City. It was a burgeoning community. Also some German people. Tough jobs working on the railroads. There was no insurance, no Social Security, and lucky was the person who worked on the rails for a long period of time and retained all 10 digits of his on his hand. It was a very, very hard work. Um, and there was really no services within the community. There was no regulation because everything was handled by Newtown, which was in Elmhurst, which was the township seat. So this is the reasons that they organized, and this was actually through their church, the Catholic Church, organized the community, got a petition signed, sent to Albany. Albany passed legislation, they could become a city. And that's when Long Island City got its start, which gave them the opportunity to tax businesses, tax landowners with large estates, and they used this tax money to improve services. For example, they built schools, they built better streets, they built, it was the beginning of a city that actually did very, very well for itself in a space of one generation. To the right, you'll see Hunters Point. Here is Newtown Creek. Here is the East River. There are the various rail networks. There are sheds. There are yards. And you can start seeing the housing is starting to get developed on this picture. This dates from the early 1870s, within the first generation of or within the first decade of the creation of Long Island City, when much of the area was still marshland that was being filled in, but not for long. As I mentioned before, the area had rather poor regulations, and even though they had some very good industry developed, the poor regulations meant that they attracted the kind of industry that New York or Brooklyn did not want, such as slaughtering houses, plants that would boil bones for glue, had noxious vapors, smelting of copper. It was a very, very unhealthy place to live. And there was a big outcry among the people that surrounded these areas to try to improve, the working, the living conditions within the area. Fires broke out continuously. And the Long Island City Fire Department had their hands full, not in putting out, a house fire, but putting out, a refinery fire, which is something of a totally different level. Long Island City, when it became part of New York City, unlike the other outlying areas like Jamaica or Flushing, the Long Island City Fire Department became part of the New York City Fire Department as equals. The same with the Long Island City Police Department, became part of the NYPD as equals. There was no intermediary situation where there were probies or what have you. They hired them directly because they felt that these uniformed forces had the kind of training and the kind of experience that was the equal to anything else existed in the rest of New York City. Now, New York City brought something besides sort of cleaning up the act in terms of legislation and laws. It also brought money. And that money changed the character of the community dramatically. First of all, they were able to raise the money for a direct transportation link to Midtown Manhattan, the Queensboro Bridge, which at its time was the largest bridge spanning the East River. And they were also able to put a railroad tunnel in for the Long Island Railroad so that you didn't have to take a ferry. You could actually start in Penn Station and go through the tunnel, come out in Queens, get on the viaduct, cross the Hellgate Bridge, and go to New England or points north, upstate New York. The Sunnyside Rail Yards, which was a huge transportation facility, was created at this time, a switching station. Lots of jobs, lots of opportunities. But one of the finest additions to the community was the creation of Degnon Terminal. Degnon Terminal was a phenomenal industrial city that to this day, I think would be still considered to be up to date in its own way. You look at these buildings, compare these buildings. This is a Moose Wiles Biscuits, Sunshine Biscuit Factory. Compare these buildings to the kind of tenement buildings that you'd see in the Lower East Side that fire traps people would work in. These were made of reinforced concrete. They had large windows. They had excellent ventilation. They were all but fireproof. Excellent locations for a factory and places that people would want to work in. So when these buildings went up, the area became populated with model housing, Matthews Flats, the Sunnyside community, Sunnyside Gardens, which is a model community, was within blocks of Degnon Terminal. So you had housing, transportation, the number 7 line came in. So suddenly, within a space of 10 years, this area became fully developed. In addition to that, you'll notice that this is a railroad network. These are railroad tracks that goes into Degnon Terminal, and you'll see that there is a siding in each one of these buildings. So a car, say a flour, would be pushed in here, and they would unload the flour in the front and take it up to the top floor. By the time that came back down to the ground floor, you had biscuits and bread. And they'd be loading that in the back of the car. Then a donkey engine would take it out, connect it in the yards, and this stuff would be headed out to Philadelphia, Buffalo, Boston. But again, the bread was still warm. In the front here is a lagoon. This was Dutch Kills, which was a direct water link to Newtown Creek over here. So that you actually had international um, uh, business. You would have ships coming in from Europe, from Latin America, unloading and loading here. So you had both forms of transportation, intermodal transportation, both water and rail. State of the art, perhaps equaled, but I don't think these places, really had ever been surpassed in terms of making a fantastic industrial area here. And this is a picture of what the area looked like uh, about 1950 or so. There's Dutch Keels, there's Degnon Terminal over there. And you can just see, and there's the Sunnyside Yards. And you can just see this area is just crammed full of industry. There's Newtown Creek, there's the East River. And I always tell people, this is really the heart of American industry. And it's amazing when you look at each one of these buildings here. Each one was started by somebody with a dream and was able to realize this. A lot of money was made in Long Island City. But all things have to end. You had situations where somebody would work in a factory and they'd look at their sons and daughters and say, well, I don't want you to work in a factory. I want you to become a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. You'd also find that iron ore deposits were found in some other location in the earth, and they would say, let's put a factory here as opposed to taking all this stuff to the United States and employing people from different countries. The industry started to spread out all around the world. The factories were getting worn out. They were getting rusty. They were starting to fall apart. And you had a lot of disinvestment here in the 70s and 80s. The areas were cleared out. There were a lot of oil spills that they discovered in the creek. So it was time for a reboot. And this is where our friends from the Newtown Creek Alliance come into the picture. The Newtown Creek Alliance is dedicated to finding a new reuse for the Newtown Creek area, cleaning up the industrial wastes from previous generations, and finding, and making this a gem as to what it used to be. Because they said back in colonial times, this was an absolutely lovely. It's almost was compared to like a Garden of Eden. You can see the river still winding through here. Here's the cemetery that I had mentioned before. The Calvary Cemetery is this huge area of trees over here. And what we're going to do now is take a quick trip down Newtown Creek. All these pictures are by Mitch Waxman, who is a board member of the Newtown Creek Alliance, and incidentally, a phenomenal photographer. He has a blog in the community, the Newtown Pentacle, that is popular. A lot of people read. This is returning back to Degnon Terminal. There's the lagoon. It's no longer used for shipping. I don't think anything's really been shipped through there in the last 10 years. And the bakery went through several changes, industrial changes. And when the last tenant left, they found a new use for it as LaGuardia Community College. It's considered to be one of the finest community colleges in the country. It has a first-rate staff at the college. Um, it's a 2-year program. They have fabulous archives. Um, and every building in the former Degnon terminal has found a new reuse, such as this. Of course, part of the past remains. This was an area that was used uh, back in the 19th century where they did the slaughterhouses and the bone boiling factories, they called them. It was a terrible location. Well, thank heavens that's all gone. But we still have to reuse resources. We can't throw stuff, and we need a place that we can recycle stuff. So this is, at least in the immediate future, still being used as a recycling area for scrap metal. It's centrally located in New York City. It's a fantastic location. I think plans are being made to relocate this elsewhere, but for the immediate future, this is being used as a recycling facility for scrap metal. And behind this is another interesting building. This is the Newtown Creek wastewater plant, which can handle something like up to 310 million gallons in a day. It handles almost 20% of the city's waste treatment. Now, the problem is that in New York City, it's an older sewer system, and should we have a bad rain, the plants, even plants like this, get overwhelmed if the rain is big enough, and the water gets discharged directly into the East River and Newtown Creek. It's really interesting. In most cities around the world, this is no longer the case. I mean, New York is almost at this point an outlier in terms of still having basically 19th century sewage. And there are plans to, as I said, to build other plants. And the Newtown Creek Alliance is very much interested in, as many other people within the community, of moving forward with some of these plants. Because again, the water, the Newtown Creek is polluted directly with sewer water that's still being poured into it. Mitch is a phenomenal photographer, and this is a really fabulous picture of the Greenpoint Avenue Bridge. It's sort of showing how beautiful art can come out of something as prosaic as a bridge. Greenpoint Avenue was an avenue, originally was a turnpike between Greenpoint or Williamsburg and Brooklyn and Flushing. Um, it becomes, before it goes too far in Queens, it becomes Roosevelt Avenue, which is the street that's under the number 7 line that goes to Flushing. So these streets are still very used. A lot of heavy traffic on them. After 150 years, these roads are still never been busier than they are today. There are still refineries that are on Newtown Creek. Not everything has left the creek. This is a picture of a tug and fuel barge that are heading up the creek. But it's interesting to see the beautiful skyline of New York City in the distance. And it's be interesting to see how long it's going to take for that skyline to kind of leap the East River. One of the nicknames we have for Long Island City is, New York's other city, and it's only a matter of time before skyscrapers like this will be, already in the Long Island City waterfront in the last 20 years has a number of skyscrapers that are either in the process of being built or being built. I think it's considered probably the fastest growing community in the country. And again, we have another picture here of the city during sunset. This is actually the site of one of the most tragic oil spills in our country's history. Back in the 90s, they had discovered that there was some oil in the water, and they looked into it and found out that for the previous a number of decades, oil had been leaking into Newtown Creek, and actually underground, a plume was under a portion of Brooklyn, or something like 3 million gallons, they think, leaked. It's probably the largest oil spill in the United States, twice the size of the Exxon oil disaster. You know, they're looking again to ways to remediate this. But even the Alliance has said, you know, we'd be happy if 80, 90% of this would be remediated. We think it's probably impossible to ever get this completely pure. The base, incidentally, of Newtown Creek is, they've done core samples of something like 10 to 15 feet of gunky, like very thick muck that is just full of pollution, 150 years of pollution. Here's a view of Calvary Cemetery from near Newtown Creek. It's amazing when you have something like this of greenery and trees, you know, literally a place of repose. There's, as I said, 3 million people buried here. It's the largest cemetery, I believe, in terms of internments in the country, if not the world. The Kosciuszko Bridge replaced the Penny Bridge, the small bridge you saw with the funeral in an earlier slide, in 1940. And the Kosciuszko Bridge was never really built to be a part of the interstate highway system, but it found itself becoming part of the interstate highway system and had to handle traffic that was something like 10 times what it was designed for. It was a real dangerous road to drive. And there were many, many accidents on it. And unfortunately, it was recently replaced in 1917, 1918, with these bridges, cable stay bridges, they're called, that cross over Newtown Creek. Again, a thing of beauty. Illegal dumping, no, has been a bane of Newtown Creek for generations at this point. And they are in the process of trying to dredge the creek and to rid it of as much of this junk as they can. They've got quite a task ahead of them, but they have been making fantastic progress. And as you can see from this lecture, Newtown Creek is awakening from its past. And this is a pretty good picture of that. On the right, this is the site of the original settlement, by the way, in the English Kills. On the right is a cement plant, industry, a fantastic image of industry. And to the left, what do we see? We see trees, we see rocks, we see nature sort of standing patiently by, ready to reclaim her own. Grand Street Bridge. Now here's a cute little place here. This bridge dates from about 1900. It's very, very narrow bridge. It looks like something upstate New York. It's amazing to have the heart of New York City have a bridge like this connecting the two boroughs. They do have plans to demolish this bridge and widen it, but I can assure you it will not be an attractive a bridge as our Grand Street Bridge looks today. So again, this is an echo of the past, soon to be replaced. This is one of the several combined sewer outfall locations. This is the sewer that directly feeds into the headwaters of Newtown Creek. This is unfortunate, but it's on everybody's radar. And as soon as practical, this kind of treatment of Newtown Creek will be ended, hopefully sooner than later. And this completes our tour of Newtown Creek. We are almost 4 miles from the East River. We're looking back. You can see the city in the distance. And what do we have in front of us? Well, it's foliage, it's trees, it's nature. Nature is always standing ready to work with us, ready to reclaim her own. And that completes the Newtown, uh, Mr. Waxman's uh, portion of the photos. Uh, and now we will talk about some idea of the future of Newtown Creek, just very briefly here. Developers have always dreamed about doing things along the waterfront. People love living along the waterfront, it has beautiful vistas. Back when New York City made a bid for the Olympics, for the 2008 Olympics, they wanted to put an Olympic village at the head of Hunter's Point here. There's Newtown Creek, there's the East River. That never came into fruition, but recently a developer has put in place a major project that he'd like to see at the edge here of the land here in Queens. There are beautiful parks that are being already in place here. The gantries are over here. The gantries were the lift bridges that used to help remove cars off of float barges onto rail. They kept them there as a tribute to the past. And it's really great that the industrial past is still being respected and honored in the 21st century as we move on to other new vistas. That being said, we can dream of the future, but the legacy of the past will dog us for quite some time. These are signs talking about warning people not to get near the water, not to get to near the creek. And it's really a shame that something as beautiful as a resource like a waterway through the heart of New York City has chain link fences and warning signs telling people to stay away from it, at least until we can figure out how to make it accessible. But man proposes and nature disposes. And I took this one picture of a goose with her young ones walking along Newtown Creek. And I've always called this Mother Nature's vote. Nature says basically, we haven't gone anywhere. We'll be back. And you're certainly going to enjoy it when we're there. We have a book, The East River, which covers Newtown Creek. It's the first and only book, as far as we know, that's ever been written about the East River. It's Arcadia Press, several hundred photographs and text about the development of the East River and its tributary Newtown Creek. You can buy it on Amazon or through Arcadia Press directly. And that concludes our lecture for Open House New York, a joint program by the Greater Astoria Historical Society and the Newtown Creek Alliance. Restore, reveal, revitalize. Thank you, folks.